All right, now let's look at question E. Here we're sort of saying if tax equity investors invest 240 million, minority owners invest 90 million, what would be EDP's anticipated IRR on its residual flows, okay, if it's 51 share? How much does this project financing strategy boost the return to investors? Well, basically, if we go down here, okay, the sponsor's equity, okay, the sponsors, okay, go down here, the sponsor's equity cash flows look like this. But basically, if they we have something like minus 3,887 and plus 240 is coming from tax equity plus 90 here. So what we wind up with is net about 57 million investors for the sponsors equity investors, something like that, because we're taking into account the cash flows. So investing $57 million, they get these cash flows. They wind up with an IRR of 13.8%. All right, so what do we have? Okay, let's go back. Tax equity, minority investors, and we have sponsored equity. Okay, going back over here, we go to this. They get about, tax equity gets about 5.6% IRR. They're up there in front. Then we look at the minority investors. Minority investors. Okay, minority investors wind up with a okay, and so now let's look at the minority investors, and what I'm going to do is I can just copy this. And I'll just put in the formula. Minority investors wind up with, okay, okay, 6.59%, but they're 13.8%. All right, and so okay. So from a particular point of view, winds up significantly boosting their, if they owned it and they took all the cash flows, they would have got about 9.8%. If they grew through this whole thing, they wind up with 13.8, because what they're doing is allocating value down the stream sort of to less risky investors. And they have a much more risky stream because they're sort of at the end. All right. So part of this is that, so we've gone through this and we determined what's the value of the stream overall, how does it then get divvied up in terms of value between tax equity investors, minority investors, and the sponsors equity, who are left with the residual income across the whole thing. All right, so the strategy here is, unlike APV, actually separating out and selling these flows, okay, to investors, which enhances the return for EDP on doing the investment, okay? So let's go back to the basic questions we had for the case, and we go back and so what returns and risks does each class of investors face? Well, basically the idea that we had talked about here was that since there's sort of a pecking order when people are going to get paid, okay, tax equity investors are the ones up front. They're the ones most likely to get the benefits that are accrued to them. Next comes, because most of that's with regard to tax credits, not necessarily cash flow. Next in line would be minority investors. They get 49% of the cash flow, and so their positions are quite different in terms of who gets what. But the returns to EDP are much higher because of this structure. All right.